morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to welcome you to Tulane University and to this summit. As some of you may know, this is the first summit in what will be a series of summits on the topic of race and poverty. And I'm delighted to see so many people here at the initial one itself. I wanted to take a few minutes to give you the origins of this institute and what we're trying to accomplish through it. I don't think there's anyone here that I have to describe what this region and New Orleans and Tulane University went through in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. But out of every great tragedy, there comes some opportunity and some good. And one of the commitments that Tulane University made in the aftermath of Katrina was to create a new entity in the university called the Partnership for the Transformation of Urban Communities. This is an entity we had not had before at Tulane University, but we felt that one of the most important contributions that Tulane University could do for our community and for our region would be to help in the transformation and recovery of New Orleans itself. We created that institute literally within 3 months after the storm itself, and I'm very pleased that Joel Devine, a professor of sociology, agreed to be executive director of what we now call PTOC. For those of you who don't know Joel has been at Tulane University for many years and was, prior to executive director of PTOC, the chairman of the sociology department. And I know Joel is someplace, and Joel, I wonder if you wouldn't stand up and please be recognized. Joel has done a remarkable job, and I'm delighted that we were able to persuade him to take on the challenge of PTOC. When we looked at PTOC, we said, what priorities should we have within this particular partnership? That is, where should we put our emphasis, our time, and our resources? Because we cannot be all things to all people. And we decided that there were two areas where we probably could have the most profound impact and where there was the greatest need. Those were in the areas of race and poverty, and the other was public education. And of course, those two intersect in our city of New Orleans in a very profound way. We therefore created the Institute for the Study of Race and Poverty, and we would not be able to have done this without the support of the Ford Foundation. And I'm so delighted that the Ford Foundation helped us mount this institute, and we have great promise for it, and we know we will make the Ford Foundation very proud, as well as doing good things. We also started another institute. It's the Institute for Public Education Initiatives. That institute is also up and running, and the total focus of that institute is to advance student achievement for all students in New Orleans and beyond in the region, so they can graduate from high school, go on to college, and be prepared for the workplace. And that institute was formally created and started on March 1st of this year. And in fact, I think it's very appropriate. The next summit hosted by the Institute for the Study of Race and Poverty will actually be a joint summit between the Institute for the Study of Race and Poverty and the Institute for Public Education Initiatives. And they will come together to talk about both of these topics. I'm also very proud of Rebecca Chason, and you just saw Rebecca. Where is she again? Rebecca, come on up here. I want to make sure you get properly recognized. Rebecca is a faculty member in our School of Social Work. She is also the director of the Porter Cason Institute, and she has a terrific background in administration and as an academic. I know you're very bashful, but you'll still be seen. But I'll tell you, we would not be here today if it weren't for the great work of Rebecca. So would you please join me in thanking her for her work? It's all about the hugs and the kisses, I have to tell you. It's all about the hugs and the kisses. If you have not heard so far, I want to tell you what the mission of our Institute for the Study of Race and Poverty is all about, because I think this mission statement, which is succinctly stated in one sentence, tells you what we're trying to do. To achieve greater understanding of racialized poverty via research and education, and to promote change in existing policies and practices that negatively impact people of color and the disadvantaged. That is our mission statement. Our mission involves more than just doing research and education. Those are the prime drivers. But those drivers ultimately have to lead to change in behavior and for conditions to be better for people of color and of lower socioeconomic classes. That's why this institute is here. One of the things we learned, I think, in the aftermath of Katrina, which we knew about before Katrina, but it really came to the surface, is the tension we have in our own community around race and poverty, and how race and poverty has been one of the biggest challenges we have to confront as a community if we're ever going to turn into a world-class 21st century city and region itself. It's a difficult topic. There are not many communities around the country that I have seen that have successfully addressed this topic and actually made a difference at ground level. That's what we want to do here. We want to do our research, we certainly want to educate, but we want to make a difference. To elevate people out of poverty and to confront all the issues and challenges we have in any kind of ism in our community, especially racism itself. That's why we're here today, to begin a community dialogue on these issues so we can begin to understand them, we can begin to understand them in our community, and then begin to develop interventions to try to make life better for people. And just looking across this audience, I suspect a lot of great wisdom and knowledge will come out of today's session. I'm also deeply appreciative of the work that Dr. Roland Englund has provided for our institute. And Dr. Englund, if you would please rise and be recognized. For those of you who don't know Dr. Englund, he heads up the Initiative for Regional and Community Transformation at Rutgers University, and he is a co-sponsor of this summit. As I told Dr. Englund, I have a particular fondness for him since I was born and raised in New Jersey, right next to Rutgers University. I know what a fine institution it is, and I know the great work they do there. To have you associate with us does us pride, and we're delighted to have you. And of course, today we're going to start out with a superb introduction to the topic from, I think, one of the most distinguished people in the country to talk on the subject of race and poverty, and that's Professor John Powell from Ohio State University. I already told Professor Powell, I apologize in advance, that I'm going to introduce him, but I can't listen to his address. But I was very honest to tell him I could better spend my time here than what I'm going to do after this. But unfortunately, as president of the university, they get me mired down in other activities that I don't find very productive, but someone else does. So I apologize in advance to you that I cannot hear your address to the audience. But I do want to introduce you to him. Dr. Powell is an internationally recognized authority in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, and issues relating to race, ethnicity, poverty, and the law. He is the executive director of the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State that deals with these issues, as well as holds the Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Moritz College of Law. Dr. Powell has written extensively on a number of issues, including structural racism, racial justice and regionalism, concentrated poverty and urban sprawl, opportunity housing-based housing, voting rights, affirmative action in the United States, South Africa, and Brazil, racial and ethnic identity, spirituality and social justice, and the needs of citizens in a democratic society. Every one of those topics is near and dear to our heart and something we need to learn more about. Dr. Powell previously founded and directed the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. He has also served as Director of Legal Services in Miami, Florida, and was the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, where he was instrumental in developing educational adequacy theory. He's worked and lived in Africa, India, as well as doing work in South America and in Europe. He is truly international in scope and impact. Professor Powell has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia, and he joined the faculty at Ohio State University in 2002. Under his leadership, the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State has taken a national leadership role in developing, advocating for, and researching an opportunity-based housing model. This model provides a critical and creative framework for thinking about affordable housing, racialized space, and how an individual's destiny is impacted by where they live. The central principle of this model is that residents of metropolitan regions are situated within a complex and interconnected web of opportunity structures that significantly shapes the quality of their life. These opportunity structures include education, healthcare, employment, transportation, and civic engagement. As I was thinking this morning about the introduction, and I was thinking about this topic, about opportunity-based housing model, I couldn't think of a better topic for you to be talking about today in New Orleans. Because this is one of the most significant issues we are facing right now as we rebuild our city. Besides public education, it happens to be a topic that's also near and dear to my heart because I serve as a commissioner of the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority. And one of the main topics we have as we go to rebuild the city itself is how do we do equitable housing and rebuild our city? And in fact, just the very concepts and principles that you are going to talk about today are the very concepts and principles that I think will hopefully form the foundation of what we do here in New Orleans. So even though I won't have the privilege of listening to you today, Professor Powell, I know that I already resonate with your words and your thoughts, and I will make sure that I get a transcript of this. And it's now my pleasure to introduce and welcome, and I hope you will join me, Dr. Powell.
I found out this morning that I have less time than I thought, so I went through and started rearranging my slides, and hopefully they're still in order. But I'm leaving all of my slides here, including the ones that I won't have a chance to really discuss. So I may go with some things very quickly, but you will having trouble hearing? Let me take this. So I'll be leaving my slides here, and so hopefully you have a chance to look at them, even if we don't have a chance to talk about them today. And so the framework that I'm going to talk about briefly is structural racism, and what are the implications for Katrina and beyond, and some the implications for rebuilding New Orleans. Now, we all have heard the term racism, but we usually think of racism in individualistic terms. And one reason for that is that we came of age as a society around people like George Wallace, people like Bull Connor. And so as our society began to think about racism, we thought about it in the most individualistic terms. When we think about racism, we always think about the racist. Who is the person who's having this personal animus toward people of a different race? And what structural racism invites us to do is to think about it differently. We've made some move away from individual racism instead of thinking about it extremely narrowly, to think about institutional racism. And I want to distinguish between the two, and you'll see why it's important to distinguish between the two. And institutionalized racism recognizes that institutions themselves can actually structure racialized outcomes. And the law is starting to recognize that, and we're starting to recognize that somewhat in our society. So then we shift our focus when we think about institutional racism from just looking at the intent or the motivation of an individual to think about the practices within an institution, the norms within an institution. But institutional racism have us focus largely on a single institution. And what structural racism asks us to do is to look at the interaction between institutions. So it's not just what's happening within an institution, but what's also happening between institutions. Now, one of the things that's particularly important about both institutional and structural racism, and there's some similarities, but important differences, and the significance of some of these differences will become more apparent as I go through my slides. structural racism and institutional racism is about a cumulative model of mutual causation. So it's not one thing that you can point to that's causing a particular outcome, but the outcomes both accumulate, or the causation both accumulate and interact. So it's hard to sort of sometimes locate a single thing to identify when we're trying to figure out what's causing these racialized outcomes. And we've seen that here in New Orleans. So they say, well, what caused the damage to your home? And they say, was it the wind? Was it the water? Was it the poor structure foundation? And of course, the reality is all those things. All those things are interactive. And the failure to sort of acknowledge that things are interactive causes us to miss things frequently. Sometimes I say that old adage of what was the straw that broke the camel's back? The reality is every one of them. It wasn't one straw. It was all the straws working together that broke the camel's back. And so it invites a process that is well known in medicine and in environmental field called systems thinking, to think about how things interact to cause particular outcomes. And so one way of thinking about this is that we all live within systems. We all live within webs. And these webs they affect us in terms of positively and negatively. We call it a web of causation. And so when we talk about a good neighborhood, we're not talking about just a house in a neighborhood. We're talking about there's low crime. We're talking about there are nice places to walk to. There are nice places to shop. It has good schools. It has clean air. It's all of those things coming together. And those things have a powerful impact, positively or negatively, in terms of how we live our life. And so we interact with this opportunity structure. And one way of thinking about opportunity structure is the operation of structural racism. So structural racism is an analysis to understand racial disparities. And once we start understanding that, then we sort of try to order those structures to produce positive opportunity. So we look at the various things one would need to have a positive outcome in one's life. And most of us do this all the time. When we go pick a neighborhood, again, we don't just pick a house. We want to know what kind of neighborhood this is. Are the property values increasing? Who are my neighbors? What's the grocery store like? If you have children, again, you're certainly concerned about schools. So again, we sort of do this intuitively, and this is really just lifting it up. And what we have started doing around the country, and we actually have done some of this in New Orleans also, is to really map out opportunity structures for a whole region. So you can see where the neighborhoods and regions, parts of the region that has very high opportunity, and what part of the neighborhood has very low opportunity. And then we take that and overlay on that where people live, where we have public housing, where we have subsidized housing. And what we say is that as we think about public housing and subsidized housing, especially public housing, because we place public housing, we determine where someone's going to live. And we say that those decisions should be informed by the opportunity structure. Think about No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind basically says if a kid is going to a failing school for so many years, he or she should be able to move to another school. And it's one of the largest federal programs dealing with schools. Then you think of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit is the largest federal program for the production of affordable housing in the United States. What we do with the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit is we build homes largely in distressed communities. We build homes in communities where low-income people with families are then going to go to distressed schools. Then we turn around with No Child Left Behind and say, if you're going to a distressed school that's not working for you, you should be able to move, or you should be able to send your kid to another school. The obvious The obvious thing that's missing is we haven't linked those two programs together. We should be taking our low-income housing tax credit money and putting those schools, those homes in areas where they're high-performing schools. Instead, we do just the opposite. So it's an example of our single focus creating counterproductive outcomes. Now, when we think about structures, this structures really is a process, and it's actually an interesting process and a little bit complicated. But so there's something called feedback, and I'm sure all of you heard of negative feedback and positive feedback. But let me just take a minute and say how that relates to this. When you have a system and you introduce something into the system, sometimes the system will absorb what you've introduced and not change. And I'm sure all of us have had this experience of trying to do something, you introduce something in, and nothing seems to happen. That's called negative feedback. The system has taken what was introduced and accommodated in such a way that it didn't really have to change. Positive feedback is just the opposite. Positive feedback is when you introduce something into a system and then things start happening very fast, beyond, and they don't happen linearly. They happen exponentially. And positive feedback can be in a positive direction or in a negative direction. So, for example, I'm sure all of you have heard of the concept of white flight, right? So there's a psychologically, sociologically, there's a point where people of color may come into a neighborhood and people are happy to see them. White folks are happy to see them. And then you get to a point where they're not so happy anymore. And something starts to happen, and the neighborhood changes very fast. So the first example would be negative feedback. That is, nothing much happened. The neighborhood stays pretty much like it was. The second example would be positive feedback, where all of a sudden, everything starts to change. And so when you deal with systems, when we talk about structural racism, the idea is to identify what will cause positive feedback. Also, we need some time to identify negative feedback, because negative feedback often frustrates us. We introduce something into a system and nothing happened. You know, we said, well, we gave them more money and the schools are no better. What happened? And what we're experiencing is negative feedback. The system has accommodated. You haven't gotten to that tipping point or turning point. So part of what structural racism invites us to do is to identify negative and positive feedback within a system. One of the differences between institutional racism and structural racism, as I said, is institutional racism is within a single institution. So if you have a school, for example, and things are not going well within the school, at least ostensibly you have one person who can say change. You have a principal who can order change within that institution. The complex thing about structural racism is that because you're talking about things between institutions, so let's say the housing is being placed in an area where it's creating negative impacts on the schools. The principal of the school can't go to the housing authority and say, stop putting houses here until we fix our schools. There's no command authority in one person to coordinate what's happening between these institutions. And so you need collaboration. You can't simply order it. You need a network of people working together to produce a set of outcomes. And unfortunately, many institutional actors don't have a culture of working with people outside of their institution. And it's a process. So you have to translate between these different institutions and engage in a process. Now, the failure of having an institutional model, a structural model, the failure of having a structural model for dealing with problems is no more extreme than right here in the New Orleans area. You have all of these systems, all of these institutions broken down, and these different institutional leaders have no formal relationship with each other. So one person is trying to fix housing, another person is trying to fix the school, another person is trying to fix transportation, another person is concerned about jobs, another person is concerned about the environment. And at best, there's a weak relationship between them, and sometimes they're working at counter purposes. So you need some place where these people can come together and both understand the problem collectively and coordinate it. And one of the things I hope is that the institute that you're starting here might play that role of coordinating all of these different mechanisms and helping people see how they work together. Now, when we look at these structures and these institutions interacting, another thing that's particularly interesting is that we don't necessarily see Bull Connor. We don't necessarily see George Wallace. We don't see someone we can point to and say, that person is a racist. And yet, how we arrange these institutions and what they do have predictable, at times, racialized outcomes, without necessarily there being a particular racist actor that we can point to. And that also is important because in our society, because we grew up thinking that racism is about Bull Connor, when we don't see Bull Connor, we don't see racism, even when we see racialized outcomes. And so after the levees broke, I got a number of calls from media folks around the country. And the question that they kept asking me is, so, do you think George Bush is a racist? And it's like, who knows? But what was clear is that a whole host of policies, including the response, had predictable racialized outcomes. And it was confusing America, because here they say all these black folks trapped on top of their roofs. And instead of looking at the systems of the levees, the system of divestment that had been going on for years, the system that had segregated black folks in New Orleans, the systems that had meant the schools were not adequate, the systems that didn't provide for an adequate way of leaving New Orleans, they looked for Bull Connor. And when they didn't find Bull Connor, they got confused. And then there was this debate that went on for weeks while people were trapped on top of their roofs, is this racism or not? And there were a number of pundits who then told us, because if you said it had racial implications or was racist, again, they wanted to find Bull Connor. And when many of them couldn't find Bull Connor, they concluded this has nothing to do with race. This is about class. It must be about something else. And it reminds me, there's a famous American philosopher. I'm sure many of you heard of him. His name is Richard Pryor. And Richard Pryor tells a story about he's in bed with another woman and he's married and his wife busts into the bedroom and he looks at her and his wife and he says, "Are you going to believe me or your lying eyes?" And that's the situation we were after Katrina. America was like, it looks like it has something to do with race. And people were saying, are you going to believe your lying eyes or the experts? And we're telling you there's no racism because there's no Bull Connor. So we need a more sophisticated way of understanding how racialized outcomes are produced, and structural racism helps give us that. And so this is just a schematic presentation of some of the difference between thinking about race in a traditional way and thinking about it in a structural way. And at the bottom, again, I have the one-dimensional approach as opposed to the multidimensional approach. The bottom, again, represents mutual and cumulative causation. Another example of that, and I think this is really important, I want to dwell on this a little bit. Excuse me. This is really ways of knowing. And we're not trained to know when things are happening in a cumulative way. We're trained to look for the single cause. And if we can't find the single cause, we get confused. Maybe think there is no cause, or it's mysterious. And give you just a couple of examples of that. When there was a famous school case in Detroit where they found the schools to be intentionally segregated, the court ordered the city and the suburbs to desegregate because Detroit had was so segregated that you couldn't desegregate the schools just by focusing on Detroit. And so they ordered the city and the suburb to be integrated. The Supreme Court reversed, and the Supreme Court said, first of all, this is a school case. Now, we do notice that the housing is segregated in the region, but we have no idea why housing is segregated. And so since we don't know why housing is segregated, you can't have a remedy to fix it. So this is another turn. A structural racism analysis is an empirical analysis. And by empirical, what I mean is that sometimes we know things work, and we can't point to the single things that's causing them to work. If you think about the cocktail for HIV, doctors will tell you that they can't tell you what specific thing in that cocktail is making the person better. In fact, maybe it's the combination, but they can't isolate it. But they can tell you that in many conditions, the cocktail will make someone better. The flip side of that is smoking. For many years, the tobacco company was able to avoid liability from smoking because they would say, you say smoking causes cancer. How do we know that? Is it the first cigarette? Is it the second cigarette? Is it the first puff on the second cigarette? And what about the person who smoked for many years and never got cancer? And so for years, people were trying to find the cigarette and the puff of the cigarette that caused cancer. And they couldn't find it. We have a similar discussion going on right now about global warming. And it sort of speaks to the complexity of how things actually happen and the simpleness of how we know things. First of all, in terms of global warming, think about it. Sometimes we have a position that unless someone intends something to happen, there's nothing we can do about it. So unless someone intends a racialized outcome, there should be no social intervention. So my guess is that most of you got up this morning and drove your car here. My guess is that none of you were intending to heat up the earth. None of you were intending to cause global warming. And because no one is intending to cause global warming, and to some extent we don't know exactly what caused global warming, doesn't mean we should have no intervention, we should have no social policy, or we can say our collective action, complicated as it is somehow contributing to global warming, and we probably can do something about it. So structural racism basically builds on the same kind of model. And again, it's interactive. I know you can't read all this, but the idea is that we're looking at outcomes. So, for example, when we put kids into failing schools, why do those schools not serve kids? Is it the teachers? Is it inadequate classrooms? Is it the other students? Is it the curriculum? If we put kids into schools that really work well and they do better, we should be pleased. And we might want to know what's contributing to that, but we can't always know exactly. And it might be, as I said, interactive. So here are some of the things that structural racism suggests that we do. It suggests that we look at the interrelationship between institutions. It calls for a strategic and dynamic understanding of how they interact. It shifts our attention away from individuals. And it says because there's a process, we have to monitor what's going on. And one of the things that again, structural racism invites us to do is to avoid what I call static polarities. Is it one or is it the other? But instead to think about a process. And Linda, we were talking about that this morning. You see that right now here in New Orleans, where people, static are ways of knowing, basically have us look for a single thing without thinking about how that thing interacts with other things. So right now there's a big debate as to whether or not to rebuild public housing. And we make a whole set of assumptions about that. And the assumption is the world is going to maybe stay exactly as it is and we'll rebuild public housing. Or the world is going to be another way if we don't rebuild public housing. Instead of thinking about a process, the process of how do we, the goal is not really to rebuild public housing, the goal is to house people. And the goal is to house people where there's opportunity, where there are good schools, where there are jobs. But it's a process. And can rebuilding public housing facilitate that process? The answer is yes. Could we rebuild public housing in such a way as to retard that process? The answer is yes. So it's not simply do you rebuild public housing or not. The question is, can you have it facilitate a process, and how would you do that then? How would you adopt a process that would lead us to having people housed and eventually having people housed where there's opportunity? The opponents to rebuilding public housing, one of the arguments is the housing is bad housing and it would put people in ghettos. The proponents who want to rebuild public housing say people need housing and they need it now. Well, is there a way of doing it so that you can limit the negative, so that you could create a transition where people could be in housing, because the alternative is no housing. Could you create a process where people could be in housing temporarily in their way to better housing? Could you refigure the housing? I mean, so each one of these things are related to other things. But if we only think of one, it limits our set of responses. It limits our set of possibilities. I'm going to move through some of these quickly. So one of the things that structural racism suggests we do is to look at the fairness of the institutional arrangements, not simply the fairness of the individuals. Are the institutional arrangements fair, both to people of color and to other people? And again, all of this stuff is being discussed here in New Orleans and with a passion. So for example, I think many people would say the insurance industry is not being fair. Is the insurance industry being racist? Maybe, in a narrow sense that they might be making deliberate racialized decisions. But even if they're not making deliberate racialized decisions, my guess is that some of their practices will have predictable racialized outcomes. And again, when you think about rebuilding, you can think about rebuilding the homes, rebuilding the levees. But if you don't have insurance, it doesn't work. So you have to have all of those things, hold on to all those things at once. Now, one of the things I want to say, and I think it's further in the slide, but I'll mention it now, is that because structural racism basically says, look at how these institutions interact with each other, there may be a sense of, wait a minute, this is way too much. You know, now I have to deal with not just housing, but I have to deal with insurance company, and I have to deal with education, I have to deal with transportation, and the world is becoming too complex. I can't deal with all those things. But remember what I talked about earlier in terms of positive feedback. Positive feedback really says when you can make a strategic intervention on one or two areas, it has impacts in other areas. So it's trying to find out what is that strategic intervention that I can make that will have impact across several different domains. And it might be insurance, it might be housing, it might be, but a strategic intervention is concerned more than just trying to fix the one thing you're working on. It's trying to figure out what that thing is that will then create leverage in other domains. But because we're talking about a system, we have to actually monitor it to see if it's having that impact. We can't just introduce it and then think that we're done. And that's one of the difficulties with the way we're approaching rebuilding in New Orleans. The way the government is approaching rebuilding New Orleans. It says, I've done my part, now I'm done. It's not, I've done my part and I see that it's really having this leveraging effect across the whole region. It's like, no, we gave the money, federal government, we gave the money, and if they don't spend it right, what can we do? You know, we're just the federal government. We've cleaned up some of the toxic stuff in New Orleans. We're done. Instead of looking, what would it take to actually create this kind of process? Now, these are some of the challenges, obviously, that you face, but I'll go through these quickly because I think you know these better than I do. But part of the challenge, I think, is a reframing of what's going on. That New Orleans really represents something that's happening in the whole country, a disinvestment that happened for the last 35 years. And so what the levees breaking and the wind exposed potentially was a failure that's been going on for 35 years. So it's interacting with that. And, you know, there are other communities around the country that are poised to actually suffer the same way or similar way, maybe not as dramatic as New Orleans. We're disinvesting in all across the country. The good news is that it potentially affects everyone, so there's possibility of getting greater traction. The bad news is that we don't really understand it very well. And we have to really talk about it in terms of investment, and not just in terms of taxes, right? It gets framed, if it's framed in terms of you want more, spend more money in taxes as opposed to invest more money, it feels very differently. And because it's the whole country, again, potentially reframing it, we may get more traction. One thing also about investments suggest a return, right? Taxes suggest a decline. You're taking my money and you're taking my money and I never see it again. That's how we think about taxes. An investment is that someone's taking my money, I'm putting it someplace, and years later, wow, I got more money back. So we really have to think about what we're doing, are investing in our society, investing in our people, and there will be a return in many different respects. And the failure to invest also has serious costs and consequences. So part of what we're calling for is responsible government. We've been talking about structural racism, talking about these institutions. One individual or one party can't really manage this. You really need a responsible government. That's part of the role of government. But you also need citizens and people to help define what those strategic investments are, what those strategic interventions are. And the good news, again, is that we're having some success with this in other parts of the country. We're seeing people starting to understand that there are multiple things operating on people across the whole region, and you can make interventions to actually change people's lives in a way that invests in people and the region. It's not simply taking something from one person and giving it to another. This is a comprehensive opportunity map in the Baltimore area, and you can see where The darker areas are the areas where there's very high opportunity, the lighter areas where there's low opportunity. And one of the things, and then you see the green dots is where we're building public housing in the Baltimore area. And right now you see almost all of the houses built where there's low opportunity. And so we're saying that's just bad policy. Now, if you just think about housing, you would miss that. Because one of the things that a lot of housing advocates will do is say, look, the land is cheap. It doesn't cost much to build, so let's build it there. But then there are all these problems that happen because we're segregating and concentrating people away from opportunity. And then we sort of struggle for the next 30 years about what to do about that. So there's starting to be a real shift in the Baltimore area and other parts of the country. But the first part was to actually dramatize the opportunity and how it's distributed throughout the region. And you can define opportunity in a number of different ways. Another thing to really focus on is that people are linked, and the region is linked. And so we have the whole idea of linked fate. The harshest thing about racism in some way is that it denies that we're linked. So what happens to black people or Latinos, or if you're not in that group, the suggestion is it has nothing to do with you. So we need to turn that around. And basically, and again, what was demonstrated here is even though the suburbs weren't hit as hard, the failure to invest affects the whole region. It affects it unevenly, but it affects the whole region. So, and this is something I guess I would say very strongly to you, and especially Rebecca. So even though you focus on race and poverty, to do it in a way that allows everybody to show up in the picture. To give you just an example of this, there's very good research now that shows that when you just focus on racial disparities, which a lot of the literature on race does, and so you say, you know, really talk about incarceration rate or a high school dropout rate, it does two things. First of all, it normalizes whiteness, right? So whatever whites have become the norm. You say blacks don't have as much health care as whites. And we want to close the health care disparity. But you don't look and see where whites are. So you say blacks, only 40% of blacks have adequate health care, but only 70% of whites have adequate health care. So we want to get everybody, we want to close the disparity. You can close the disparity by bringing blacks up, by bringing whites down, or somewhere in the middle. It's neutral on how you do that. And in fact, I've been working with Dayton, Ohio, who's been working for 10 years to close the disparity between blacks and white. The good news is the disparity has closed significantly. The bad news is because whites are worse off, not because blacks are better off. So the language about disparity really hides a lot of things. And what's been happening in the United States and what's been happening in the region is that, yes, there's a huge racial disparity there that we have to pay attention to. But at the same time, the well-being of whites in our society have also been on the decline. And if there's no one talking about that, it's hard for people who feel like their lives are in trouble to suggest that they should do something to help others. The example I use is that because of global warming, we're all on this giant ice cube, and because of global warming, the ice cube is melting. And the strategy is to move to the middle. And the people on the edge of the ice cube are blacks and Latinos and poor whites. And so we watch people fall off, and our strategy is to move to the middle. We have a personal strategy to deal with a public problem that ultimately can't work because when the ice cube finishes melting, there is no middle. So we really are linked, even though we'll watch some people fall off and we'll be like, wow, I'm glad I'm not on the edge. But now I am on the edge. And a graphic example of that, and I'm almost out of time, is the dislocation that's caused by globalization. If you think about it, the dislocation that's caused by globalization started in rapid response in the 1970s. It largely affected blacks. And we had a whole industry of books writing about the new concentration of poverty, about the dislocation of the black family, about the dysfunctionality of the black family, about William Jewis Wilson wrote a book, When Work Disappears, not globalization, when work disappears. And the idea is that there was something wrong with black folks because they were getting laid off in Detroit and Pittsburgh at the steel mills. 30 years later, globalization has come to the white community. And no one's writing a book about the pathology of the white community. Now we talk about globalization. We lost 30 years because we didn't pay attention to the people who were falling off the edge, and we thought we were safe. But now the engineers and even computer analysts are starting to be affected by globalization, and all of a sudden we want to do something. But we lost 30 years as a society. So we really need a new paradigm that really links us and understand how we're linked. So hopefully we have learned something from Katrina, about our society and about how our institutions and structures are failing us. And we can make progress by investing strategically. So let me just close again by saying that structural racism is a way of knowing. It's an alternative way of knowing. We tend to know by analyzing instead of by synthesizing. We tend to know by looking at an individual thing instead of looking at a system. And so structural racism invites a different way of knowing. And it also invites a different way of being because we all inhabit these structures. And so oftentimes when we talk about racism, it's a hard discussion, in part because some people feel like, you know, you're blaming me. I didn't do anything intentionally. I didn't do anything at all. What we're asking people to do is take responsibility for our institutions and the work they're doing, to notice the work they're doing, and to make them work for us. Institutional arrangements are not neutral. They have a huge impact on all of our lives. And structural racism says they have, at this point, racialized outcomes that hurt us all, and we can do better than that. Thank you.